Revelation is a revealing or an unveiling. So this is the work of Jesus unveiling the future to us. He's given us believers a look at how the end comes. So that's basically what that means. He's taken the wraps off, he's taken the seals off, and he's allowing us to see what the future holds as far as he's concerned, and he knows. He's the only one that knows. So let's go ahead, we'll get started right away. We left off with verse 8 last week, so we're going to go ahead and get into verse 9. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read the whole passage first, and then we'll go back like we always do and dive in and break it down verse by verse. So here we go. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, is it up there? Yeah. And the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands. Oops. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and a golden sash around his chest. And the hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Okay, so that's a lot. So let's go ahead and dig in. We're going to unpack it and really just look at it deeply. So let's start with the first couple of verses here, verse 9 and 10. Again, the John in this letter is the Apostle John. How do we know it? We talked about it a little bit last week. The John of this letter is the John well known to the readers in the day it was written. It's kind of like he's saying, hey, it's John. You know me, John. It's not like he's really getting into detail about which John he is. And he's obviously writing to the churches, and they would know who he is. If the writer had been anyone other than John the Apostle, he would have been more specific in his description. Notice he calls himself your brother and fellow partaker in the persecution experiences of the early church. More evidence that this is the Apostle John. But probably the best evidence of all for it being the Apostle John is the statement that he was imprisoned on a Mediterranean island called Patmos because of the testimony of his faith in Jesus. So here's a little map kind of showing that area. It shows the 7 churches that are named, but it also shows the island of Patmos in the lower right. And that agrees with the early church tradition that records John as having been exiled to this island by the Romans because of his teaching and preaching about Jesus. John was the last surviving apostle. All the other apostles had been martyred at this point. John ministered in Ephesus, which is, as you can see on the map, just a short distance from Patmos. And so again, everything points to this being the Apostle John, and that's what most all the leading authorities believe is the Apostle John. The early church reported that this letter was written in the very late 1st century, which means probably as late as 95 AD. It means it's the last work of the Bible chronologically. So not only is it the last book of the Bible, it's also the last one written chronologically. We know from the Gospels that John was probably the youngest disciple. How do we know that? Well, if you look in John 13 where it describes the Last Supper, it describes John as sitting just to Jesus' right. He was right there. And in that day, they always positioned the youngest next to the guest of honor. And so it's clear that he was the youngest. He was probably in his late teens to early 20s at that point when Jesus died on the cross. So it means John was probably in his 80s or possibly 90s when this was written. And he was on Patmos. Early church fathers report that John was put on Patmos by Roman Emperor Domitian. And after Domitian died, John was eventually freed from Patmos and allowed to return back to Ephesus. And if so, we can imagine that he delivered this letter to the 7 churches which is why we have a copy of it today. So notice John says here that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and the Greek phrase Lord's Day is written in the adjective. It's a Lordy day, or a Lord-filled day, if you will. So when combined in the Spirit with a Lordy day, or a God-filled day, John seems to have been experiencing an especially Spirit-filled day of meditation, prayer. I can just picture, I don't know if you've all felt it, but I certainly have, where I really feel the Lord's presence, and I usually start crying. I mean, I'm just a big baby, and when I feel His presence, I start crying, I start bawling. It's in that prayerful attitude of submission to the Spirit. And, if you imagine this now, He's on an island, he's by himself, and he's in deep meditation, and imagine someone coming up behind you and speaking loud like a trumpet blowing. Michelle is laughing right now, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you a little story. About a little over 30 years ago, her and I went to Cancun, and we're sitting in a Mexican restaurant. We're in a booth, and everybody's mingling around, and we're sitting there and just enjoying company. Well, unbeknownst to me, and of course she didn't tell me, right behind me, a roving mariachi band is forming up. And they've got the sombreros and the garb, and one guy's got a guitar, another guy's got a horn, and I can't remember what else. Well, they decide they're going to start playing. I don't know anything about it. I'm sitting here talking to her. Well, right over my left shoulder, the horn. And I come up out of that booth just about. She said my eyes were like saucers. She can't tell the story to today without laughing. I mean, she can't even finish the story because she thinks it's so funny. I think I had a little pea spot in underwear at the end. Woo, that was scary. So I can relate to what John must have felt right there. He's in this deep meditative state, and this loud trumpet-like voice, but it conveyed speech that John understood, and the first words John heard were instructions to write. So let's look again at 11 and 12. It says, this voice said, "Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna and to Pergamum and to Thyatira and to Sardis and Philadelphia and Laodicea." And then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. So John's told that he must write a book of what he sees and send it to the 7 churches. Notice again, he records what he sees, not necessarily what he hears. This isn't necessarily dictated to him in words. It's played before him like a movie, and then he's got to record what he's seeing. Some of it is dictated in words, but for the most part, it's played out like a movie. And he's got to record what he's seeing. The 7 churches named here are all in Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. We'll look at each of these churches in detail in chapters 2 and 3. So only now, at this point, John doesn't have a chance to turn. He hasn't had a chance to turn yet. Now he's gotten over the startled thing, and he finally turns, and his mission to report what he sees begins, because this is what he's seeing when he turns. So the first thing John notices is 7 lampstands, and as we read on, we'll see what else he saw. "And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength." I mean, wow, can you imagine all the descriptions I've seen where the Lord is seen in his glorified form, and we'll see this later in this chapter. John fell on his face as if dead, because it was such a startling thing to him. And I can imagine, us sitting there, and we turn, and there's the Lord in that glorified form. I mean, I mean, I can only imagine. I think probably John's face must have looked something like this. And I'm not going to leave this up here because you'll never hear another word I said. But that's one artist's rendition of what John maybe looked like when he turned. But this is another artist's rendition of what he saw. This has a few errors in it that I'll point out, but it's the best one I could find. And of course, the first issue is with the lampstands. Verse 12 says that the first thing he sees is the 7 lampstands, and almost all the drawings I found have these single lampstands. The lampstands aren't described in detail. If you remember our rules, we go back in the Bible to find out where lampstands were mentioned before, and we probably would end up more like this. This was the menorah lampstand that was in the tabernacle, as described in Exodus 25. And again, you notice there's 7 lights. So that number 7 keeps reappearing. 7 lampstands, here we got 7 legs. The modern day Hanukkah menorah has 9, has 8. But the original one that was, if you read Exodus 25, you'll find that it had 6 branches and 1 in the center. So now standing in the middle of these lampstands is a figure, and it's clear that he is the focus of the vision. And if you notice the description in Revelation 1, it begins with a phrase, one like a son of man. That phrase clearly points us to Jesus. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. But in the context, it simply means someone who looks human, but not yet exactly human. At first, the figure looks human with a robe down to his feet and a girded sash around his chest. And these details are reminiscent of person in authority. That's what people who were kings and high officials wore. And so that right there tells you that who he is or what he is. But the not exactly part becomes clearer as we read on. His hair is white as wool like snow. His eyes are like that of a flame of fire. Now, I don't know about the other men in the room, but I've seen that flame of fire in eyes before when I've been in trouble. Not pointing fingers or anything.
I've never seen it.
I've seen that flame of fire. No Chuck had. But the flame of fire. His face is shining as bright as the sun. Imagine trying to look into the midday sun. I mean, you really can't even do it. And it says that verse 16 says that he has a two-edged sword coming in out of his mouth. That's the other mistake in this artist's depiction. You don't see the two-edged sword. So the question is, how do we interpret all these details? These are obviously symbols, and they're important symbols, or they wouldn't be there. So what do these stand for? Well, remember our rules of interpretation? Where do we go? We go into the Bible, right? We always go back in the Bible. And last week I showed you the stars and the lampstands and what they stand for. That's actually in the same passage. It's later on. It's verse 20. And this is what it says about those. It says, as for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. And the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So we know from our study last week that 7 means 100%. We go back in the Bible and we see 7 of this, 7 of that, 7 days of creation, 7 times they had to march around. All that with 7s, it means 100%. It means completion. So it's easy to understand that the seven churches is the 100% of the church, including up to today. That's who that represents. And the 7 stars with the 7 angels, that would also be 100% of the churches and 100% of the angels. So you might be saying, well, okay, I'm the church, so does that mean I have a personal guardian angel? 100% of the church has 100% of the angels. Do I have it? Well, to look for our answer, again, we got to go back to the Bible. Everything's in the Bible. I don't Google any of this. I look at it in the Bible. Look at what Hebrews 1:14 says about angels. Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Who's inheriting salvation?
We are.
So the angels are here to minister to us and to give us what we need to do, what God has called us to do. Notice in our passage in Revelation it says they are all in Jesus' hand, which means that he controls them. They're under his authority. And we know 7 represents 100%, so that makes it easy to understand. The 7 stars represent the angels that are serving all those in the church, and that's us believers. And they're serving us to help us to be able to do what God has called us to do.
So it's literally angels and not servants in the church or leaders in the churches.
The angels that are helping the servants and the leaders in the church. Yeah. I mean, I feel guided all the time, and when I'm preparing this study, something's guiding me. And it's the Holy Spirit in me, but also there's angels that are helping out with that too. Now, does that mean nothing's going to ever go wrong for the servants of God? Well, no, not necessarily. But it does mean that these angels are going to minister to us. Remember how many times the angels ministered to Jesus? And the same thing with us. So, you know, Jesus wasn't removed from the 40 days of temptation, but at the end of the 40 days of temptation, he was ministered to by angels. Same thing when he was crying blood, tears, just before his crucifixion. So what about the other details that Jesus experienced before John? What about all those other things? Again, there's no immediate explanation of these in that passage, but if you go back in the Bible, then you start seeing where these things have been repeated and talked about before. So let's read a few verses of the Old Testament where we see some of these things talked about. So we'll start with Daniel 7:9. And it says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire." Kind of looks familiar, but if you look at Daniel 10, you'll even see more. Daniel 10:4-6 says this, "On the 24th day of the first month, I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl. His face was like the appearance of lightning. His eyes like flaming torches. His arms and legs like gleam of burnished bronze. And the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude." So Daniel pretty much sees the same exact thing that John sees in Revelation. So what John is seeing here in Revelation is consistent with how the rest of the Bible describes the Son of God whenever he appears in his glorified form. This is how he looks. So now we go to Isaiah to find several of these details and how they're brought together for us. What do they mean? What does each one mean? So let's go a little deeper here and look at this. Isaiah 11:1-5 says this, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt on his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins." So several features, John's descriptions are interpreted here. It's clear from the passage that this is a description of Jesus. It's the shoot that springs from the stem of Jesse. The Spirit will rest on Jesus, but notice if you look closely, again, the Spirit is mentioned 7 times. If you break it down, Spirit of the Lord, Spirit of wisdom, Spirit of understanding, Spirit of counsel, Spirit of might, it's 7 times. Again, you're seeing that number 7 in regards to the Spirit, and that's going to become important later. We're going to talk about it when we get all the way up to chapter 4. We're given even more explanations for details John gave us in Revelation. Jesus judges and discerns what is right and what is true, not by what he sees or what he hears. Righteous judgment can't rely merely on what's heard because of rumors or gossip or whatever. True discernment rests on what must be known firsthand. Jesus looks at our heart. He knows what's in our heart. When you're out there serving Him, He knows the motivation of your heart when you're serving Him. Are you serving Him so that you'll get all kinds of gratification? Or are you serving Him because you just love Him that much that you want to serve Him and you couldn't do anything else? He knows what's in the heart and judges based on that. It says Jesus will strike the earth with the rod from His mouth. And that is, by what comes from His mouth, He slays the wicked. And right away we see why He has a sash or belt around Him. His righteousness and faithfulness are pictured by the sash or the belt around His waist. Revelation says chest, but it's still a sash or a belt girding Him. So if you put it all together, to sum it up, what Jesus' appearance is saying to John, first, Jesus is glowing white, symbolizing purity and holiness. Jesus is holy, 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 and He's perfect. And that's what that white symbolizes. His robe represents His role as priest and king, and His sash represents faithfulness. His eyes of fire symbolize piercing discernment. His face shines like the sun, representing the light of truth and His pure holiness. His glowing bronze feet represent judgment, as in the way fire tests the quality of metals. And they also represent His bringing wrath against sin with the sword from His mouth. So, if you look deeply at it, what we're supposed to be is the light of the world, and that's, there is no darkness. We're the light of the world, and we're going to be talking about that more next week as we come back. And so that's pretty much all I had time for. I probably could have put a little more in because I didn't know how fast. I never know how fast it's going to go. I could have 2 pages and it takes the whole half hour. I could have 20 pages and it only takes a little time. But anyway, that's kind of how it works. So we can go ahead and end the recording. And before we finish.